What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Common Coder. My name is Josh, and in this video we're going to be learning about semantic HTML. Specifically, we're going to learn about what it is, why it's important, and then we're going to go ahead and look at a couple demos and go through an exercise of converting a non-semantic HTML page into one that uses semantic HTML elements. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites in order to follow along with this video. The first one is that you'll need to make sure that you have a basic understanding of HTML, and we're talking very basics here. So just know what HTML is, what HTML elements and attributes are, and that will set us up for learning about what these semantic elements are and how they can help us write better HTML code. Now, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code in this demo, so if you want to follow along with me, you'll want to make sure that you've downloaded and installed Visual Studio Code, but if you use another editor, that's totally fine. You should be able to follow along. So what exactly is semantic HTML? Well, when we use the term semantics, what we're really talking about is meaning. So semantics in this case equals meaning, and it's really about what HTML elements represent inside of our web pages and web applications. So on my screen here, we have a very simple example of an H1. Now an H1 is a heading element, and there's various levels of these. So there's an H1, which is the top level heading, and this goes all the way through to H6. And basically these are a way to sort of title different sections of your web page, with the H1 being the most prominent of these titles. So for example, if you had a web page that was all about video games, for example, your H1 element at the top of the page would be all about video games. So it's used to essentially label or title what the content of the page is actually about. Now this H1 gets a certain styling from the browser by default, and we could sort of fake that using a span or a div. By setting our font size, in this case to 32 pixels, and then adding some margin on the top and bottom, and then none on the left and right. Now we'd also want to make this a block level element. I just didn't have enough space here on my demo, but you get the idea, right? So the semantic meaning of an element is very different from the presentation or the way that it looks when it's rendered onto the screen. And so essentially these would render text that looks nearly identical, but the semantic meaning or the understanding of that element for things like search engines or assistive technologies like screen readers would be very different. And so let's go ahead and take a look at what that means in a little bit more detail. Now again, semantics is all about meaning, and if you provide more meaning to the elements on your page, you get a handful of benefits that you might not have been aware of. So for example, using semantic HTML elements helps search engines better understand your content, which leads to better SEO or search engine optimization and ultimately better rankings. The search engine can understand the different sections of your web page. It can better parse them and figure out, how to serve up those web pages to users that are looking for that type of content. It can also help screen readers. Now screen readers are an assistive technologies to help people with visual impairments, and it can help those screen readers understand that content as well. And this concept is known as accessibility. So if a screen reader knows that your navigation section is inside of a nav element, for example, it can better read that out to a user using one of those types of devices or software. In addition, your code is just cleaner and easier to maintain. So it's easier to identify and see visually if something is a heading, or if it is a footer, or if it is an article, if those tags actually represent the contents that's inside of it, versus having to sift through a bunch of divs and spans that don't really have any semantic meaning. This can also lead to better code suggestions and autocomplete depending on the editor that you're using. So different tags have different attributes that can be applied to them. And so using the correct elements, you'll be able to see through your editor what attributes can be applied to those specific tags. And finally, using semantic elements helps mirror proper custom element naming conventions. And so this is very common when you are building web applications with something like React, or using web components or some other framework that has this concept of a component. You're essentially creating custom elements at that point. And so using semantic elements just kind of falls in line with this modern way of building web applications and websites, where you are using a specific element for the intended purpose. So for example, if I'm putting a link on my page, I would want to use an anchor element and use the associated href to link to a particular page, rather than sticking that in a span, making it look like a link, and then using JavaScript to programmatically link to somewhere else. There's no need to do that. We have an element that does that already. So you always want to lean on what is available before you start going out of the box and creating custom things. And so using semantic elements really helps us get in that mindset of using the correct element for the correct job. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of semantic elements. So we have our structural tags, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but we're going to go ahead and just look at a few. So we have our structural tags, which include things like the nav. So this is used for building navigation menus. We have a header, which is used for introductory style content, which could contain something like an H1 inside of it. We have our main element, which is used for the dominant content that lives inside of your body tag. So essentially, what is the main purpose of this web page? And then we have a footer element, which is used for copyright info, related links, things of that nature. And we're going to go ahead and see examples of these in a real life website in just a minute. From there, we have content grouping tags. So things like form are used for collecting information. So a form tag contains other form elements like inputs, drop downs, text boxes, text areas, things like that. We have a section tag, which is used for grouping generic standalone content. So a particular section of a web page where all of the elements inside are related in some way. We also have an article tag, which is used for self-contained content. So this would be something like a blog entry or a forum post, things of that nature. You could probably extend that out to social media posts and things like that. Basically, you could take that content and extract it and put it somewhere else, and it would essentially be its own self-contained thing. From there, we also have text level tags. So things like strong, which indicates strong importance or seriousness of a particular part of your text. We have an EM tag, which helps stress emphasis in certain parts of text inside of a larger paragraph, for example. We have other tags like block quote, which indicates a quotation of text. So imagine you're authoring a web page and you are quoting some content from somewhere else. You can use a block quote tag in order to represent that in your code. And there are many, many more of these types of tags. And so for a full exhaustive list, you could check out the MDN web docs on semantic elements. Speaking of those MDN docs, here is the URL to the information on HTML semantics. And we can go ahead and glance at that real quick here. Semantics, particularly in programming, refers to the meaning of a piece of code. So this extends actually beyond HTML and into CSS and JavaScript, but it's most prominent inside of HTML because we have these specialized tags to represent the various pieces of our HTML documents. But we can read through here, and if we scroll down a little bit, we can see here are some more examples of semantic elements. And we can go ahead and click on this elements link here to see kind of a full exhaustive list of all the HTML elements that we can use and what their semantic meaning is as well. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at a real life example of a pretty well done semantically correct HTML page by heading over to apple.com. So if we go to apple.com, we can pretty clearly see just by looking at the page that we have some structural elements here. So we have a navigation bar up here at the top. We have a couple different sections of different types of content. So we have these big Jumbotron style product highlights here at the top. Scrolling down a little bit farther, we have some smaller sections of maybe different promotions or different things Apple has going on. Farther down we go, we have a little bit more of that, a little carousel with different things related to Apple TV Plus. And then down here at the bottom, we clearly have this footer section with all of these different disclaimers, along with related links and kind of like a secondary navigation here down at the bottom. So we can actually take a look at the HTML that makes up this page by right-clicking anywhere on the page and clicking inspect. And what this will do is it will inspect that particular element that we clicked on by opening the dev tools on the elements tab here. And what I'm gonna go ahead and do is just kind of collapse the style section and then make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. And if we scroll all the way up to the top, we can see here is our HTML page, and it's a bit overwhelming, and that's okay, but we can clearly see that Apple is using semantic HTML elements here. So here's our main body section, which is the visible portion of the web page. Inside of here, we have an H1 that says Apple, and it's actually hidden, but they're using this for SEO purposes, most likely. If we scroll down here, we have a div that's kind of grouping the header information. And inside of here, we have a nav, which represents the navigation up here at the top. And there's some other things here. I don't work for Apple and I don't help design their site, so not really quite sure what they're using some of these other tags for, but they are using the semantic HTML element. So they are using an aside here to provide some additional information as related to the nav. But the most important thing here is we can see that they're using the correct tag for navigation to indicate that this is a navigation bar. And you can see as we hover over these, it highlights the associated element on the actual web page. So we can see there is the navigation. If we scroll down a little bit more, there is the main content. Then we have various sections, and these have classes on them and a data attribute indicating what these different sections are. But we have a section here, which is a ribbon up here at the top showing some kind of promotion. If we collapse that, we can see that there's another section here, which is the hero section, or essentially like a jumbotron, showing kind of the most important part of this landing page, which is obviously the launch of the iPhone 16 and iPhone 16 Pro. If we scroll down a little bit more, we can see that there is a promotion section. So we have different promotions for Apple Watch, AirPods, AirPod Pro, AirPod Max, so on and so forth. If we scroll down a little bit more, we have the Apple TV section. So this is all of those promotions related to Apple TV and the various things that you can watch on Apple TV Plus. Then we have another section which indicates this gallery of various things. And then finally at the bottom, we have this footer, which contains all of the disclaimer text and the navigation section that's at the bottom of the page. And if we drill into this and then drill into this div, we can see that even inside of the footer, things are sectioned off using semantic elements. So we have an H2, which is labeling this as the footer. Again, this looks like it's hidden, again, probably for SEO purposes. Then we have a section with all of the footnotes and disclaimers. We have a secondary navigation down here at the bottom, which is also using a nav. We have another section, which is like the bottom section of the footer. And finally, some script tags that are probably related to this footer. Again, not sure of the architecture of this page, but we can clearly see how the HTML is structured using semantic elements to provide meaning to essentially everything that is on this webpage, which is pretty cool. So feel free to check this out for yourself. Go to apple.com. Remember, right click anywhere on the page and click inspect. Click on your Elements tab. So this is the developer tools for Google Chrome, and you should be able to explore and expand the various content, this HTML content that is inside of this window here. All right, so what we're going to do now is go ahead and walk through a conversion of a non-semantic HTML page and refactor it using semantic elements. So what I've done here is created this index.html, and it's just a simple profile page that you would see for like a personal website. You can see it just says my website. We have a lot of divs here with various classes that we're using to style the page. Now, this isn't a video on CSS. We'll go ahead and talk about that in another video. But for now, just know that we're using these classes to provide styling to our web page, whereas the HTML itself provides the structure. And if you notice, we can kind of assume what these various elements do by looking at the class name. However, that's not helpful for something like a screen reader or a browser, for example, because you could literally put anything as these class names. Rather than wrapper, I could call this, my thing, right? And as long as my class name in my CSS was called my thing, then the styling would apply and things would just continue to work even though the name has been changed. So this is why semantic elements are so important, because things like classes and IDs, these are user defined. They can literally be whatever you want. And so having things that are structured, that are meant to represent the certain elements that you are using is a big help, especially for things like search engine optimization, screen readers, accessibility, things like that. So if I go ahead and change this back, you can see that we have kind of a wrapper that is wrapping our whole page. We have kind of this header section here. We have a section for our content along with various subsections, very similar to what we saw in the Apple demo. So here's another section here. This section contains an article. There's also a sidebar and a footer down here at the bottom. But if you notice, all of these are divs, right? So this div has no semantic meaning. It's just a block level element that is used to render something on the screen or group things on the screen. So before we make any changes to the page, let's go ahead and preview it in the browser to see what it looks like. So this is the page. You can see we have a heading section up here at the top with a header of my website. We have some navigation elements here for home, about, and contact. We have some content over here that is introducing the site. We have some recent articles. So these would be links to maybe articles that I've written on this page. And then we also have this little sidebar over here with popular topics that we can explore, like web development, JavaScript, and CSS. And then down here at the bottom, we have a footer. So very simple, but we do have some structural elements here. And what we want to do is go ahead and update our code to match the meaning of what we're trying to do here in our web page. So if we go back to Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and start with the top section here by converting our header section to use semantic HTML elements. So the way we do this is inside of our header section here, this div can actually be represented using a header element. And if we remember our header element from earlier, this is used to group introductory content. And you can see that Visual Studio Code is going to help us out, and it's going to give us the MDN description of these various elements. So the header element represents introductory content. So a little wordy there, but in the second sentence, you can see that it typically contains a group of introductory or navigational aids, which is what we have here. We have our introductory heading along with our navigation. And if we remember from our introduction to these elements, we can go ahead and use a heading here. So we can use an H1 because this is going to be our top level heading. And then for a navigation, we can go ahead and use a nav element. And notice how each time I'm changing one of these tags, I have to change the associated closing tag. So the nav would be right here. And then for a list, this would be an unordered list of items. So we can use an unordered list for this, which would be a UL. I'll go ahead and change this here. And then finally, for our individual navigation items inside of the unordered list, we need to use an LI tag, which is a list item. And you can see just by making these changes, we're providing a lot more meaning as to what these tags actually represent. So now what we have is a header section with an H1 that clearly represents this as my top level heading of my website. Then we have a navigation element specifying that this is where my navigation links are. And then by convention, we use an unordered list to create these navigation elements. And then inside of each one of these, we have our href, which is a link linking to our home, about, and contact sections, which don't exist right now, but could be built out in the future, either anchored to the existing page or linked out to other pages. So let's go ahead and save this. And if we jump back to our browser, you can see that nothing has really changed. So the presentation aspect of this looks exactly the same because we're using classes to style our content. However, we are now using semantic HTML elements. And if I go ahead and right click on this, we can see that represented here. There is our header along with our H1 heading, our navigation element, along with those elements inside of an unordered list, each one of those inside an individual list item. All right, so let's go ahead and do the same thing to the rest of our page. So here we have a content section here. And so since this section represents the content area, which is kind of the main purpose of this website, we can go ahead and use a main element here. And this will group all of my main content for my website. All right, make sure we always change the closing tag as well. And then here, where we have these defined sections of content, we can actually use a section tag for this. Use a section to go ahead and group this introductory message of welcome to my website and the associated paragraph. And if you notice here, we're also just using divs here, so we can get more semantic with this and use the correct tags. So in this case, this is a heading, but it's not my main heading. It's kind of like second level heading. So by convention, we would use a heading level 2 or an H2 to show that this is a heading for a particular piece of content, but it's not the main heading of the entire page. And with the headings, an H1, you should only be using one of those per page. However, if you have multiple subsections of related content that each have their own heading, then you can use the H2 through H6 as many times as you need to, as long as it makes sense from a semantic point of view. So in this case, we have a heading level 2 and then a paragraph underneath. And what we want to do is go ahead and use an actual paragraph tag here to indicate that this is a paragraph of text and not just some generic div. So let's go ahead and save that and see what this looks like on my page. We should see little to no change. And so you can see we're getting some slight differences because we're picking up the default browser styling for the various headings. But for the most part, it looks exactly the same in terms of structure and layout. All right, let's go ahead and continue. We have another section here. So let's go ahead and replace this div with a section tag. We'll go ahead and close this off at the bottom. And then here we have a secondary heading for related articles. So in this case, we would use an H2 for this. And then just under that, we have two sections for recent articles, one on how to learn HTML and one of why CSS is important. So since these are recent articles or related articles, there is a HTML element specifically for articles. So we can go ahead and use the article tag. Make sure we close that as well. And again, an article is kind of like a self-contained piece of content. So I could easily take this whole piece out of here and stick it somewhere else. And you can easily see that, okay, there's a heading that says how to learn HTML along with an associated paragraph. And this would make sense in some other context, not necessarily related to this specific page. And so that's the purpose of the article tag, is it's used to kind of group a complete standalone set of content that could essentially be used or repurposed elsewhere as its own standalone unit. And so again, here we have a heading. So in this case, we are inside of the article section, which is a level 2 heading. So for us to provide some semantic meaning to this, we would want to go ahead and use a level 3 since it's nested inside. So we'll go ahead and use an H3. Go ahead and use an H3 here. Again, we have a paragraph. Go ahead and use the correct tag here, which is going to be a PED tag or a paragraph tag. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing to the why is CSS important article. So we'll go ahead and change this to an article tag. Make sure we close that here. Then use the correct level heading, which is going to be level 3, H3, and then finally our paragraph, making sure that we add that to our closing tag. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this and jump back to the browser. And now you can see that our article section has been somewhat restyled because again, we're picking up the browser defaults for the various headings that we're using. Let's go ahead and go back. And the last thing here, we have a sidebar, which is showing some popular or related topics of web development, JavaScript, and CSS. And so this is related to the main content and helps support the main content, but it's kind of off in its own world by itself. And so for that, we would use a tag called an aside. And we can see there, an aside element represents a section of the page that consists of content that is tangentially related to the content around the aside element, and which could be considered separate from that content. Such sections are often represented as sidebars in printed typography. If you're confused about these different elements, remember you can always hover over these in VS Code and it will tell you exactly what the purpose of that tag is supposed to be. So we'll go ahead and make sure that we close this off here. And so inside of the sidebar, since this is not really a prominent heading, so it's definitely not a heading level 1, it's really not as important as these recent articles in the heading level 2. So for the sidebar, we'll go ahead and make this a heading level 3. And again, this is kind of at your own discretion as to what makes sense as far as your content is concerned. But generally for a sidebar, it's tangentially related content. It's not the main focus of what the user needs to see. So in this case, an H3 tag makes sense here. All right, and again, we have a list that we're using for this various list here. So we want to make sure that we use the correct tag here, which is going to be an unordered list, which is represented by a UL. And then each one of these divs is going to be a list item. So we use the LI tag inside of a list. Make sure we close all of these. All right, let's go ahead and save now that we've done the sidebar. Go back to the browser and take a look. And you can see that not really much change outside of inheriting those heading styles from the browser. And the last thing we want to do is go ahead and address our footer. And if we remember from earlier, we have a footer tag specifically for footer type content. So we'll say footer, close that tag off using a closing footer tag. And then inside of here, we have some text, which generally for most text can be represented inside of a paragraph tag. And there could be some kind of disclaimer, other copyright information here. Ours is fairly simple, but we want to go ahead and wrap this in a paragraph tag rather than a generic div. All right, and with that, you can see that we have converted this entire page from using non-semantic divs with labels and identifiers represented by classes. However, if you're using HTML the way it's intended, classes don't really have any meaning to the browser or any meaning to screen readers. You know, we can look at that and see, okay, like, you know, this class is a class of items, so this is some type of item, or we can see that this class is a heading 1, so that's, you know, some kind of heading. But again, this wording here could literally be anything, and the browser doesn't know what you mean when you put this information in here. So in order to convey meaning to both browsers and accessibility tools and various things like that, we always want to make sure that we're using the correct tags for their intended purpose. So let's go ahead and save this one more time, jump back to Google Chrome, and then now we can see we essentially have the same website as we started with, but we've successfully refactored this using the correct semantic tags for their various purposes. All right, and with that, that's going to go ahead and conclude this video on semantic HTML. As always, thank you so much for coding along with me today. If you liked this video and found this information valuable, please leave me a like down below, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing. We're going to be learning a lot more about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and everything else in between. So if that's what you're into, I would love to have you along for the journey. All right, well, until next time, be sure to stay curious, never stop learning, and I will see you all in the next video.